Emphasis on the first pieces of information that we received to form the impression. First impression, again, we're back to that. Primacy effect. Whatever we initially received, that forms our main impression. And then the opposite, the recency effect, is the emphasis on the most recent information. And there have actually been psychological studies done that show, especially when studying for tests or when trying to remember things, the mind will naturally remember the first things and the last things, and things in the middle tend to be forgotten. So that lines up with this primacy effect and recency effect. So we have our emphasis on the first pieces for primacy and the most recent information for recency effect. So I'm curious, even in your reflection posts, if you would like to talk about this, what are examples of each? Do you have a specific example of first pieces of information that you remembered or most recent information that you remembered? And then what are your thoughts on which is stronger? Can you argue for one or the other? Do you think that your first pieces of information lead to a deeper impression than the most recent information, or vice versa? So feel free to post on that if you'd like to do that for your reflection. Okay, so forming impressions, we've talked about how we do that. Now, on the flip side, how do we manage impressions that others form about us? And my husband is a tech guy and programmer and computer IT, whatever, all the stuff that I'm not. It works well. But interestingly, there's this growing concept in the business world and in the information technology world of reputation management. And some of you business people may be aware of this. But basically, it's the idea that businesses are hiring companies to manage their reputation on the internet. So all of the rate this doctor or rate this business, where people can go on and, comment on their experiences with people or with businesses or with companies. Clearly, most people that are happy and satisfied and content with their service don't spend the time to go online and write nice things about people. And so what often ends up happening is the blogs and the forums and the comments are typically negative. So companies are hiring people to go in and post positive responses so that there's a balance. And so often they literally are not even legitimate comments, but it is giving a more positive impression for their internet presence so that everything is not negative. So that's in the business world, managing impressions. But then on a personal level, how do we manage impressions of others if, especially, they've been formed, and we talked about how it's hard to lose those. So someone has an impression of you that you think is incorrect. What do you do with that? How do you manage that? And here's food for thought. Again, something you can reflect about. How do we attempt to manipulate our physical appearance and behaviors to our advantage? So if we're aware that people are making impressions based on our physical qualities, like we talked about, some of which we have no control over, how do we attempt to manipulate those and our behaviors, not just what we look like, but how we act? How do we change our behaviors and our actions to use those to our advantage so that someone might form a favorable impression of us? And further, on an ethical side or a moral side, is that okay? What are your thoughts on that? Is that okay that we might intentionally manipulate things to work in our favor? And then what do you think are some of the factors that guide the importance of certain activities? In other words, what might we spend more time or more energy doing certain activities or certain behaviors so that people form specific impressions of us? What guides those things? How do we make those decisions and those distinctions of, well, it doesn't really matter if I act this way or say this because I'm not really concerned about that, but this would be really important. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on those if you would like to reflect on that. Okay, so when we describe others, we organize our perceptions by developing our own theories to explain how other people in general behave, which basically is your implicit personality theory. So let's kind of tease that apart. We organize what we think about other people by developing our own theories, which then helps us to make sense of how people behave. It's kind of a broad overview of behavior in others. And that becomes our implicit personality theory. Implicit personality theories are essentially stereotypes that we apply to people. So getting back to the all old people drive slowly. That would be an implicit personality theory. Implicit meaning it is understood, it's in existence regardless of anything else. It's just there. And then a personality theory, obviously, a person behaves this way because of this. So by default, if you are old, you drive slowly. That would be an implicit personality theory. So, of course, then, we have people we like and we have people we don't like. Personalities vary, and personalities can either be favorable for us or be unfavorable for us. And so one feature common to all people is the tendency to group people into two categories. I either like you or I don't like you. There are very, very few people that do not do this pretty consistently. And, that's just human nature. We group people, that's the way we make sense of the world. That's the way we assign meaning to the world. That's why we have boxes on forms of, are you male or female? Are you white? Are you black? Are you Asian? Are you whatever? So we like to group people. We make sense of things by assigning commonalities. So along the same lines, we either like someone or we don't like someone. A specific term for that is the halo effect. So obviously angels have halos, so that can be a way for you to remember you would like that person. You attribute a variety of positive qualities to someone without any evidence that they have them. So what might be an example, that can be also something that you might reflect about if you'd like. What might be an example of someone or a group of people that would tend to have the halo effect applied to them? So you kind of just assume that they have positive qualities without any reason for thinking so. And then the horn effect, obviously devils have horns, so you would not like them, attributing negative qualities just because you don't like someone. So again, you don't necessarily have evidence that they have negative qualities, you just don't like them, and so you tend to put them into more negative categories. And what might be examples of that as well? For me, I know the halo effect. I think that you could argue that servicemen and women or first responders, so EMS, police, fire, those types of people, we tend to see them in very positive manners and we assign positive qualities. They're heroic, they're courageous, they're brave, they're strong. We assign those types of things to them. On a specific individual level, we really have no idea, but that halo effect is kind of a pervasive way that we categorize them. And then horn effect, we attribute negative qualities. I tend to be a little bit tardy, and so there's the adage that you always don't like in other people what you don't like in yourself. And I find that I tend to, when I know that people are not on time, I tend to assign negative qualities to them. And they don't care about being on time, and they don't respect other people's time and all those things. And what's interesting is that's something I struggle with. So obviously it's kind of rubbing me that I tend to be that way too, and that's something that I work on. But that's an example of the horn effect. They're not necessarily a negative person or a bad person because they're late, but it's very easy to just kind of lump that into one of their faults instead of just saying, well, they happen to be late. It doesn't really reflect on them as a person. So now that we've talked about perception, let's talk about barriers to accuracy, because again, I asked the question, how do you handle when an impression has been formed? Well, what are barriers to accurate perception? That's important. Brainstorm. You can do this on your paper or in your head, whatever. Just kind of jot this down if you'd like. Identifying barriers to accurate perceptions. What immediately comes to your mind when you think about barriers to accurate perception? What would be things that are challenges or obstacles for people to make accurate perceptions about you or someone else? And as you do that, consider interpersonal communications as well as more distant forms. So in a dyad situation, you're actually face to face with another person, what might be barriers, but then further, what would be barriers through other communication channels. And then kind of as a further deeper level of processing, what might be barriers to accurate self-perceptions. So we've been talking a lot about perceptions of other people, but we talked about self-esteem last week and self-worth. How are barriers to accurate self-perceptions important, and what role do they play? And so if you jot those down and you kind of brainstorm about that and you'd like to include that in your reflection post, that would be very interesting as well, because I think the more we're aware of the barriers, the more capable we are of making sure that we do communicate our accurate perceptions, and then of course make sure that we have accurate self-perceptions as well. So here are some specifics, and obviously, hopefully you've taken some time to think of your own, but you could, if you would like, you can also expand on these ideas for your post if these are similar to what you decided. Okay, if you ignore information, obviously, the less you are processing, the more accurate you're going to be. You're not focusing on important information because we give too much weight to obvious information. In other words, that can be a little bit superficial. So we are not focusing on what's truly important because we're paying attention to things that really don't matter. And, I was curious what you might think of an example of that might be. Then overgeneralizing. We treat small amounts of information as if they were highly representative. In other words, we take a small sample of behavior and we prejudge a person. So we might interact with someone for just a few minutes, and we see a behavior that gives us an impression, and that means from that point forward we've prejudged the person, and we take that tiny little interaction as if it represents their entire personality, the entire content of who they are. And so that overgeneralization can be very inaccurate, and that would be a huge barrier because remember, once the impression is formed, it's hard to overcome. And so that can be a challenge if initially, we take this tiny little chunk and we say, oh, well, that of course explains everything. That's often not true. And then on the flip side, oversimplifying.